Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for the next episode on the No Turning Back series. Today, Stan McChrystal and I have a great discussion with a leader that we both hold in very, very high regard, Molly Joseph. Molly is the CEO of UnitedHealthcare Global, a massive portfolio under the UnitedHealthcare sort of mothership. And the member of our team here at McChrystal that has worked most closely with Molly over the years is Cricket Ole. So I asked Cricket to join us here at the front just to share some thoughts on Molly as a leader, what she learned from the time she spent with Molly, and maybe a little bit more color into the complexity of the business that Molly has to oversee as the CEO there.
Thanks, Chris. I had the privilege of working alongside Molly Joseph for a bit of time, and from Molly's background and her leadership style, I've learned to lead with authenticity is really the most important thing, to show up your full self in everything you do. And with that, you create a really dynamic team. And that's certainly something that Molly has done within her global business, having folks around the world, different cultures, different countries, being able to unify all of that through her leadership style has been really a joy to watch and something I've certainly learned from. So I hope you enjoy today's show.
That's great, Cricket. Thank you. And I agree with you. I've rarely run into a leader that I can think of that has a more complex portfolio than Molly. So there's a lot to learn here in this discussion. We have a great chat about her views on the difference between leadership and management, and how critical she thinks leadership is, especially in today's window. Her views on leading with humility, especially in times when so many things are unknown. And then towards the end, when I think you'll really enjoy, she shares some of her thoughts on sort of long-term optimism, how she thinks we're going to be better as a result of this current period of crisis that we're all working through together. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy it. So we're here with Molly Joseph. Molly, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this discussion on No Turning Back series. We'd love to start just at a high level. We've already shared with the audience a bit about your position inside of UnitedHealthcare, and as a global leader, you were, by your nature, for quite some time now, have been leading a distributed team. That's sort of a new muscle for a lot of leaders as they've gone into this remote work status. That said, this is also driving changes for anyone. You were already remote, but it's probably added some new intensity to that role and your position, how you're communicating with your team. Would love to just hear your framing on that. How did that already being positioned as a global leader change you? And then what has this last few months, what sort of adaptation has that forced in the way you're communicating and leading your part of the business?
Great. Thanks, Chris. And Stan and Chris, thanks so much for having me with you. You're two leaders that I have learned a lot from, so it's a pleasure to be able to connect with you here. Question around proximity, geographic reach, and what has changed. The way we look at healthcare and really probably any business is there's two dynamics to it. There's global and there's local, and you've got to respect both. And we've learned a lot along the way and made mistakes on both sides. Being too global and not approaching the market locally enough, and then vice versa, where you really leave a lot of value on the table because you're not learning from each other, you're not connected enough. This pandemic, this crisis is one that has really brought our overall global team, 70,000 team members, some working in health insurance, some in hospital settings, some in outpatient and ambulatory care, much more connected, despite the very local nature of how you've got to respond to local care delivery needs, which certainly have been accelerated because of COVID-19. There's such a commonality around how businesses, how the world is dealing with a crisis that is truly global in nature. And so despite the fact that we're not just geographically spread, now we really physically can't get to one another. Borders are closed. It's actually brought much closer connectivity and then much more rapid learning from market to market to market. The way this particular issue hit, we had a little bit of a geographic spread where, our businesses in Europe were first impacted. then in the United States, and then in Latin America. And end to end, you're probably looking at, a month and a half span there. So there was great incentive for all of our team members, and certainly for me, to be able to lift and learn from one market to another. And that momentum has just continued. So it actually has been, I think it's accelerated the global nature of our operating model.
Can I follow that up, Molly? Because this is something that Chris and I are fascinated with. Fusion cells, although you didn't use that term, you already had a global network with elements that were connected, and yet you, maybe better than nations or other organizations were pulling best practices, lessons learned, and spread them. Can you talk a little bit more detail on that?
Yes, we certainly have always tried to do that. I think we've done it better in the last 2 months than we have in the last 11 years. And the key ingredient is, the very nature of the unknown in this crisis, probably in any crisis, has enabled us, I think, to approach it with a lot more humility and vulnerability as leaders, as team members, which has really empowered the learning mindset on the team. And, personally, I had never made such a powerful connection between the learning mindset I wanted the organization to have and what the role of humility and vulnerability is in order to get that out of others and get that out of an organization. And I think, that as we look to not just how are we going to continue to respond today, but how will we come out of this, whether it's in a temporary modified new normal or ultimately a normal. It is laser focused on how do we make sure that we protect that learning mindset. Because, in a crisis, it enables great things, but in a normal, situation, it's really the key ingredient to how do you drive modernization and true innovation. It was a setup where I think, as human beings, it's easier to approach something like this with real humility, as opposed to, a leader that has, the answers.
So it's a fascinating point to consider, the idea of humility and some of the other sort of leadership skills that you mentioned there. Stan and I teach a leadership seminar together, and one of the points we try to make to the students throughout the course is, and if you look at case studies of great leaders, they didn't become the leader they were in that moment of crisis, or that period of testing. They put all their skills to work, and that's the leader we read about, but they spent a lifetime preparing for that moment, whether they knew it was going to come or not. And most don't know it's going to come. The point being, you can't figure it out on the fly. Spend every day in normal times becoming a better leader, so that you have these skills to pull on during moments of crisis. Would love to hear you explore a little bit with us. What were those sort of foundational skills that you've learned over the years that you knew, okay, I'm going to draw on this, an approach through humility being one of those. Did that run through your head over the last several months?
Yeah, it did, Chris. I think a global business is always a little bit stressed if you try to approach it as management as opposed to leadership. You're not there. You don't know the local market dynamics as well. I mean, you're dealing with, the higher up you are in an organization, the less you really know, and the slower your reaction is. So I think a lot about the difference between management and leadership. My reflection on a crisis like this is it is impossible to manage your way through something like this. Particularly you're talking about operating, 54 hospitals and hundreds of outpatient ambulatory settings, and constraints on your supply chain, and that plays out differently everywhere. So I try to be really intentional around leadership and management, and to exercise that muscle through the organization, which I think does leave room for that humility and that vulnerability that I talked about earlier.
Molly, we got to watch you lead before this, so we had an advantage of that. And you very much, think globally, act locally. But when a crisis comes, there's sort of a reflexive instinct on a lot of leaders to centralize and to suddenly start making decisions at their level because it's a crisis. Did you have any moments like that? And if so, kind of how did you navigate your way through them?
I think your response time needs to be so fast in a crisis. And, here we are, we're operating a health system and we're in a healthcare crisis that quite the contrary, I feel more of a pull in normal times than I did in this crisis. I mean, in this crisis, this is how do we set up the right network, the right communication channels? How do we make sure that there's transparency? We're learning from each other. We remain connected. And we're really empowered locally to respond as fast as the need is unfolding locally. And there is just no way to operate it, sitting from afar. So, whether you want to or not, you very quickly see, what a small probability of success that you have, unless you really are operating locally in an empowered way.
We've talked about this in the past, Molly, but one of the things we're trying to really encourage, and I know your head's already there, it has been for a while, leaders coming out of this don't learn the wrong lesson. In the military, we call this the guns of August. Don't fight the last war. There are key lessons now, but not every problem is going to be a global pandemic. This disease is worse because of the interconnection of the world, but we would make the argument, very, very resilient models inside of our businesses to be able to handle the next thing like this, whether it's in the cyber realm or it could be any number of things. And resilient systems do better in times of unforeseen crisis like this. Would love you to just sort of off some thoughts, because I know you've spent time thinking about this, and you obviously have a global portfolio that you have to be constantly pressure testing its resilience because you're dealing with so many different dynamics around the world.
So, I don't spend much time thinking about, what's the next crisis going to be in terms of, are we going to hit another pandemic? Is it going to be an issue with a national grid? I just know there will be another crisis, and it's going to exist somewhere within our portfolio. That to me is certainty. And so if you instead of worrying about predicting the what, you think about where do you have vulnerability in your business because you don't have agility. And I'll give you an example that I think surprised much of the world, surprised me, frankly. Global supply chains have been exposed as being really, really unstrategic, not very resilient. And, that is a huge part of this healthcare crisis, where generic drugs are manufactured and how concentrated that is in one country. It doesn't have to be a pandemic that disrupts that. It could have been anything that disrupts that. Concentration of PPE. What happens when global supply chains are disrupted and the shipping containers are just, out of alignment and out of cycle? It's really important as a team to pause on that learning and say, all right, what are we going to do going forward so that we don't find ourselves dealing with supply chain inefficiencies again? And I put that in the general category of how much time do you spend thinking about the strategic? And a really strategic aspect for any business is resiliency, as you call it. I think about it as agility. And there are learnings along the way, crisis or not crisis, on where you've got business agility and where you don't. And another aspect that I think about that is less kind of grand scale global, but just how diverse is your team? The skill sets within your team. And, any sort of business disruption, or frankly, any sort of unexpected opportunity, shows you the power of a diverse team, right? Diverse and complementary team. And it also creates great growth opportunities for people. So you've got to kind of think about, what's the agility of the business? What's the agility of the team? And how do you just constantly course correct that as you go forward in status quo? I'd be interested in both of you have such deep experience in this. Any learnings either, from your private sector days or from your military days on that very question?
Well, Molly, I would tell you that a word you used early in our conversation, humility, is the thing that jumps out at me. We're in the process of writing a book about risk right now. And it's exactly what you said. You don't know what risks will emerge. You just know that they will emerge. And so preparing leaders and preparing organizations to be able to adjust and respond appropriately to any number of risks is so key. So let me pull on that a little bit. If Chris's oldest daughter, Lanier, is a brilliant young lady, and if we gave her to you and said, create a Molly Joseph for the future of UHG, in today's environment, how would you do the development of a future leader, knowing what you know now, preparing them not for what we faced, but for what you think that they will face over the next few decades?
Well, I could never answer that question in a vacuum, because I think first and foremost, the most important thing for each of us, regardless of what position you're in, is you got to bring your whole self, your authentic self. So to me, there is no right model of, who's a future leader. It's just, you won't reach your full potential and you won't have your full impact unless you bring your whole self. And that's part of what makes a diverse team work. That's why high performing teams have diverse skill sets, and people own those skill sets. So that's kind of my opt out of the question. But the one common thing that I look for in people, and I push myself to do it as well, is really bringing a learning mindset. Yeah. If you approach every situation, and you approach your interactions with people and organization to organization with a learning mindset, I'm listening to seek to understand. I'm not listening to respond. Great things can happen, and the more diverse your team, the wider the universe of the opportunity is. But all too often, I find it, and I certainly had a point in my career where I fell into this. I looked above me for the model of what would make a successful leader, and I tried to be that. And the problem with that is you're by definition creating redundancy. You're looking at somebody else's skills and capabilities, and the organization's already got that right there. What it really needs is it needs authenticity of self. And then you've just got to have the awareness to say, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses. I'm not going to make my weaknesses my strength, but I'm going to make sure I've got a good team that's strong in areas that I'm not, and I'm going to listen to them.
Great. Can I agree with that deeply. I mean, when you look at hiring people, promoting people, getting someone on your team, how do you explore that to identify, is this person hardwired for a learning mindset? Are there techniques you've learned over the years to try to get to that in interviews, or as you're onboarding someone? Because everyone wrestles with that, right?
Yeah, I think there's a proximity between a learning mindset and comfort with ambiguity and personal agility and style, right? So they all kind of, to me, go on a continuum. Some, and not everybody needs to be, kind of pivot in the same place on that continuum, but that's a continuum that for most people is a it's a lifelong pursuit, and it's a worthwhile pursuit. And I do think you get a feel for that pretty quickly after meeting someone. And you certainly get a feel for that when you're in any conversation, that's not black and white. And frankly, there aren't a lot of black and white issues, out there in the world. Most things have a lot of shades of gray, and people's curiosity about that, and curiosity in learning somebody else's perspective on that, regardless of what very strong belief they personally have. I think all of that is kind of indicative of who approaches situations seeking to learn, and pushing a little bit on status quo, which is good for business, it's good for society, it's kind of good for the world.
Well, let me pull on something personal. Now that we're working distributed, most of us are spending a lot more time at home than we were when we're on the road a lot. You get to explore what personal operating rhythm works for you. Do you work best in the morning? How much should you work in a day? What sort of balance? How much time do you need to read or do whatever it is you do to sort of disconnect? Can you describe what works for you?
Yeah, thanks, Stan. Well, while my a typical week for me is so very different than what it's been for the last 11 or 12 years, because so much of my time was spent traveling and overseas. There are two aspects that are absolutely consistent, and they're consistent, they always have been, no matter where I am in the world. I'm an introvert. I'm a pretty extreme introvert. I need a lot of time by myself to get energy. So no matter when my real day starts, I get up and do thinking and spend time by myself hours in advance. That's my best thinking time. And I've learned that if I take some of that time and think about what do I want to accomplish today, which is very rarely kind of a list of things to do. It's actually, what do I want to accomplish? Sometimes it's really intentional reflection on what kind of leader am I going to be today? And then I close out my day, no matter how late it is, with a look back on, what did I set up this morning, and how much of that did I accomplish versus how much of that is going to be a repeat for tomorrow until I get it right. That's a routine I never break.
Is that something you've had were you hardwired like that, or is that something you learned over the years? Because I think most of us start off with checklist mentality. Here are the 10 things I have to get done by the end of the day. But I found more accomplished senior leaders pivot towards that. Who do I need to be today? How am I communicating? Have I reached those goals, rather than inbox dictating what I'm going to do during the day?
And Chris, I think it evolved. I don't know that I was always as aware or reflective of how much time do I need in the morning to build an energy bank that gets me through, a day where I'm interacting with people. And so as I learned to respect that, it's just kind of the fuel I need to get through the day. I started to get smarter about how do I spend that time, and the who I want to be, and the intentionality around how I'm going to react to both, the unpleasant and the pleasant surprises in a day, because both come, really gives me a sense of grounding. And I think I learned it step by step by step over a lot of years. And it feels really good to me. And so I know I'm doing the right thing there. Lots of parts of my life don't have that much balance, but that beginning and that end, those two bookends to my day, I guard that religiously.
Can we pivot a little bit and talk about, again, we've spoken about this a bit previously, but and maybe Stan, I'd love to start with you and hear your thoughts on, and we've talked about this a lot over the years. This is a very acute example of it. When organizations go into crisis, you get this huge surge of momentum. Everyone goes into the storming phase, and certainly experienced that in the special operations community as the world changed so radically, so quickly. How would maybe start with Stan, and then Molly, would love to hear how you're thinking about this, that pivot that leaders need to make in order to maintain the healthy part of that momentum, but then also recognize this is the new future, and so we're gonna get onto an aggressive marathon pace, and we don't know when this race ends, but we're gonna look different on the backside. How did you come to that sort of understanding yourself, and then how'd you balance that in communication with your teams? Stan, can we start with you on that?
Yeah. No, it's Chris and I experienced this together. And when we ran into Al Qaeda in Iraq, they were different than what we were prepared for. And so we had to change fundamentally. And that created a lot of energy, which overcame some inertia we had in the organization against adaptation. And that was real good. And we did it. And then there was a period at which we were moving 100 miles an hour, but that was not sustainable at an effective pace, particularly in a centralized way. And so what that did for me is it reinforced a little of what you talked about, Molly. It was really important for me to decentralize, not just because that's a good thing, but because if we were going to maintain energy, it couldn't be maintained centrally and do that. And so two things happened. I found that when we pushed down and we let them run at their pace locally, they knew when to sprint, they knew when to slow down, it was better. And it gave the entire organization the ability to hit something that was sustainable enough that we could keep it going. Now, every once in a while, I felt like I had to push the organization if I felt parts of it maybe starting to move slower than we wanted to. But in reality, I felt when you gave broad mission taskings to people, they create their own energy. You don't have to keep infusing it. And so that was, for me, maybe the big learning of that experience.
Chris, what about for you?
Yeah, interestingly, this is as a leader in an organization, this is one of the first times that I've been at the front of trying to lead through it. To your point, I certainly experienced it in the special operations in that community. What I felt changing, what I thought our leaders were doing so well, we felt that sort of decentralization of authorities, and we were able to move faster at the edge. So that was certainly allowed us to solve those really hard problems without getting mired in bureaucracy. But what set us, for me, I can say personally, what set us on that marathon mentality was the focus and discipline that our leaders put around communication, the transparency, the consistency, the more aggressive rhythm of communication. And ours was hyper aggressive, right? 7 days a week, 20 every day, years on end. We'd spend an hour and a half, and I know you know this history, Molly, locked in video communication with thousands of people around the world. And that gave you the opportunity to have a real discussion with your leadership. Over time, that was less intimidating, more small team sort of conversation at this massive scale. And that, for me personally, I think a lot of folks in the community would say, became this really powerful heartbeat. And you knew every day, some days were okay, some days were great, some days were terrible, right? But every day you were going to check in, and you felt like you were going back into the team room and getting close to those that were living that same hard problem, learning from each other, getting better together, and then you'd go back out into the fray. And if that had been every 2 weeks or every month or the more normal cadence that we're used to, by day 10 of that 2-week cycle, you would have been miserable and disconnected. And by hour 22, when you were having a terrible day, we were maybe losing people, or the fight wasn't going well, hey, in an hour, we're going to hear from everybody around the world, and we're going to reset, and we're going to be better tomorrow. And that was, to your point, that was that hyper discipline start and finish to every cycle for us became that heartbeat.
So we spend a lot of time trying to balance, managing through this crisis where, our 36,000 clinicians are on the front line providing care delivery. We've got to be laser focused on that, just like you are in a battle, with approaching this strategically, what we call the other side. What's the organization? Who are we going to be as an organization when we emerge on the other side? And whether we're putting too much energy into the other side right now, given what's happening in particular countries, My view is I'll err on the side of doing that in order to provide just enough organizational balance and mental balance so that there's the here and now crisis, and then there's the longer view of, as we step out of that, what are we stepping into? And none of us knows right now, will the new normal be a new normal that lasts for 18 months and we all go back to normal? Will there ever be, a return to what it was? But I want there to be that balance on laser focused on the here and now, what we've got to get done in order to provide, care for the people that we're committed to caring for, and the health systems we're committed to serving, as well as making sure that, each step forward is towards a North Star of where we want to be coming out. And we're still kind of feeling our way through that. And I think as a leadership team, one of our greatest fears in this is that we'll lose the momentum that we've gained, understanding that the speed and the intensity is not sustainable. But the momentum and the agility is really something worth being intentional to protect.
Yeah, if I had to break down my experiences on the receiving end of that, and this is something we've tried to put into our own thinking inside McChrystal Group, having increased our communication cadence and really trying to capture that sort of natural sense of urgency. Every day, Stan was leading, thousands of people around the world. Every day down at that front line where it matters the most, people are making these yes/no decisions. Am I going to do this, or am I going to ask permission or wait for more information? And my realization was they wanted to put, and I think this is the right answer now in problems like this, you want as many people saying yes to those opportunities, decisions, et cetera, as possible, without crossing these like existential lines where they're going to create some unrecoverable problem for the business. And if I'm wired like a normal person, every minute that goes by that I haven't heard from Molly Joseph or that senior leader, I'm going to regress back to the safe play. Most of us are just wired like that. Every time I hear from you and you explain, here's good risk, here are things I want you doing, here's the thing here's an example, storytelling, you being an honest leader about what you know and don't know, what you're comfortable with, I'm more likely to say yes to that opportunity. And when you scale out all those little yeses, suddenly you have this massive, this massive global machine in motion together. So it's not one magic button, it's all those little choices. Can you talk a little bit about optimism in this whole situation? I know the world's in a really tough spot right now, but we'll get through it, and we'll redesign ourselves. We'll act differently. What gives you hope or encouragement right now, and what on the backside of this, whenever this might come to an end, how do you think we'll be better or stronger for it?
I said it earlier, kind of the difference between management and leadership, and what gives me great optimism watching organizations and governments go through this is, in order to make progress, we have to approach it from a leadership lens, which just innately means in a more empowered operating model. And I think the downstream goodness that comes from that, innovation, risk-taking, and risk-taking can be, calculated risk-taking. Risk-taking is healthy as long as it's within a structure. Kind of flexing some of the traditional norms around what's the private sector's role and what's the government's role. And instead, we've seen organizations, all over the world really focus on balancing the traditional kind of shareholder value with societal value. And the upstream goodness that can come from that is enormous, and it gives me great hope.
Yeah, I think you're right. Molly, this has been a great discussion. It's awesome to connect with you, hear where your head is, and just to see the great work that you and your teams are doing, especially given your space at such a critical time. So, and knowing how busy you must be, given your portfolio, we really appreciate the time you spent with us here.
Thank you very much. It was so nice to reconnect with both of you. As I said in the beginning, you're two leaders I've learned a lot from. So, the pleasure is all mine.
And Molly, if you would, on behalf of all of our team, thank all of your team for what they're doing.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us for that discussion with Molly Joseph. Just a fantastic leader. I've known Molly for years, really, really inspirational. And to watch her lead such a complex global team through a time like this in such a critical space for all of us has really been impressive and inspiring to watch. So hope you got as much out of that discussion as we did. And we look forward to seeing you next time here on No Turning Back. Thanks.